Hi, it's Richard here again with the next in our series of video sequences. This one will look at unzipping and installing the different files supplied in the IP 2016 white paper for integrating with OPA 12. The environment that you can see in front of you has Siebel IP 2016, obviously, and it also has OPA 12, and it has the August 2017 release. When you open up the zip file, you'll notice that it is composed of a number of different folders. And the folder that we're going to deal with first is the Siebel CIF folder, which will require us to import these archived objects into our Siebel Tools repository. For the sake of speed, I'm going to do this in the server environment, but of course in real life you wouldn't do that. You'd either use workspaces or you'd use a local database. As you can see, this is a brand new environment. So I'm going to go ahead and log in. Now that I'm in Siebel Tools, I'm going to go to Import from Archive, accept the warning, and pick up the CIF file. In fact, if you negotiate the different folders, you'll find not only is there a large CIF file here, but in the Archive folder just underneath, there's a bunch of other CIF files that you may or may not need depending on how far you go. Let's pick up this initial one, and just for the purposes of information, we'll see that it is mostly dominated by integration objects. Notice that they come in pairs, such as CheckAlive request and CheckAlive response. You may already have guessed it, but these integration objects form the backbone of the mechanism by which we will receive requests from OPA and respond in a manner in which OPA is expecting. In addition, we have some workflow processes which will be called depending on the different action that OPA needs us to take. And we have a couple of other things down at the bottom. You'll notice a business object and a business component, which we'll talk about in a little while. I'm going to go ahead and import those, and it may be quite some time. Don't forget to compile everything. In the meantime, I am going to go and pick up the applets. Now, we won't actually be using these applets in our demo video sequences, but if you're going to walk through right to the end of the white paper and implement the symbolic URL, you will need these too. As it says on the screen, we're not going to teach you how to do a symbolic URL. We assume you can do that already. So I'm going to finish importing those. Essentially, they just add a symbolic URL button and a pop-up window to the contact list applet. So let's now take a quick tour over what we've installed and try and sort of understand what it's all about. I'm going to search first of all in my applets, and as I just mentioned, it will import a modified contact list applet with a button or two, and then we have a test pop-up which we use to display the symbolic URL. In the business component and indeed the business object, these two extra business level objects are for storing the data if you are going to be using OPA projects that have checkpoints. Checkpoints, as you'll learn later, are essentially save points which can be used to generate encoded strings which can save the exact status of your interview. A little bit like pausing a task, if you will. And as I mentioned earlier, you'll see a bunch of workflow processes have been imported. Each one of these supports essentially one method that will be called. Some of them can be used as is, as we'll see later on, and some of them will require you to either modify the one that you've imported or create a copy and use it for alternative integrations that you're building. So if you haven't already done so, now is an ideal time to go ahead and compile. As a precaution, I have gone and locked each of the projects that was involved in those imported objects. And now I'm going to save time yet again by compiling directly to my Siebel server SRF, because I've shut down my Siebel server for the moment. Again, this may take a little time, and in real life, of course, I would fully expect to be doing a full compile, but I'm just trying to make this as interactive and as punchy as possible. Now that we've finished compiling, we're going to need to publish and activate our workflows. If when you attempt to publish and activate the workflow, you get an error message like this, it's telling you that the integration objects that you just compiled need to be present in the Siebel Tools SRF as well. So the simplest way for me to get around this problem is to take a copy of the SRF that I compiled a moment ago and use it as the Siebel Tools SRF. So I'm going to shut down Siebel Tools, go to the Sieb server objects ENU folder where I just dumped my freshly compiled SRF. Once I've taken a copy of it, there we go, switch over to Siebel Tools, Objects ENU, rename the existing one in case I need to go back on it, and paste in the file that I just got from the Sieb server folder and restart Siebel Tools. All things being equal, I should now be able to publish and activate the workflow processes. Personally, I have a preference for publishing here and then activating in the client, simply because I believe it's more reliable, especially in resource-hungry single machine environments like this. I always find that sometimes I think I've published and activated it according to clicking on the button, but I then have to go back into the client and publish and activate it again. It's just a question of habit. The next step will be to go back to the folder where you unzipped the contents of the white paper and go to the XSLTs folder. These XSLTs will need to be copied into the XSLT folder of your Sieb server, of your thick client if you're going to use it, and Siebel Tools as well. You may find that there are existing files that are already there. You're going to need to overwrite them. In my case, I've done this so many times I can't remember whether I'm overwriting or not. So I'm going to check through each of these as I do it. Yeah, all looks good to me. So I'm going to make sure that I copy over the files that I need. And as you can see, as a measure of precaution, because I've edited a couple of them, I'm going to rename them. But you should be quite okay just copying and pasting the contents into the different folders. The next step is a pretty simple one. If you haven't already got it, create a temp folder in the root of C and copy the XSL files into there as well. In many of the workflows, that's where they're accessed by default when you look at the property values. And as before, I'm just going to make sure that I've copied the most recent versions, but you should be obviously copying probably into a brand new folder. Good. I'm going to reboot my Siebel server now, and I'm going to make sure that the thin client in my case comes up. And log in, hopefully successfully. The main reason I'm logging in now is because the next stage of using the files from the zip will need me to be connected to a client. Specifically, I'm going to import a inbound web service. Again, as I've done this several times now, I'm just going to make sure that I rename one of my existing inbound web services for reference purposes. When you're doing this work yourself, remember that even if you rename an inbound web service, or even if you delete it, when you try and re-import the same element again, you may well find yourself with error messages about uniqueness because of the way it stores the service ports. Anyway, so I'm going to go over to the file again, the folder again where I have the zip file contents. I'm going to go to inbound web service and import the OPA generic connector. I should now have an inbound web service, as you can see on the first line, called OPA generic connection. As you can see, if we scroll down a little bit, there's a bunch of service ports here. None of them are configured. We're going to have to configure them in a minute. But what I like to do for the purposes of this video is I'm actually going to remove most of them, and then I'm going to add them one by one so you understand what the relationship of each service port is to what OPA. So the first two that I'm going to deal with are the CheckAlive and GetMetaData. I'm going to make sure that I edit the web server and that I'm using EAI anon ENU in my case. So I'll leave you to edit those. Don't forget, of course, you'll need to edit the binding as well on the right-hand side. Once you set up those two service ports, you can clear cache and go ahead and generate the WSDL. If you don't get the WSDL first time, check to see whether Chrome is blocking pop-ups. So I'm going to rename this XML file that I've downloaded so that I remember when I do the next part later on. I'm going to go into SOAP UI, I'm going to create a new SOAP UI project, and I'm going to pick up the WSDL file that I just saved. Part 1, there we go. And we should see that there are two service ports, and I can open up the CheckAlive service. Now the CheckAlive service, when you use it in SOAP UI, you'll need to remove a couple of tags which are actually removed for you by a filter business service that we will use in just a minute. And then you will need to copy in and replace the header with a correctly formatted WSSE secure header. And when you then run your web service call, you should get a very minimalist response. Again, if you're working on an environment that is low on resources, you might find yourself, like me, waiting a little while. The response, when it comes, is minimalist and indeed completely generic. In fact, the workflow that is behind this service port is one that can be reused in every one of your integration attempts with OPA. The GetMetaData is going to require similar surgery. You're going to need to replace the standard header with your header with password and username. You're going to have to remove the extraneous tags from the body. If you get an error message, of course, I would say look at standard troubleshooting techniques. It could be, for example, as in my case, that I've been messing around with these integration objects now for several hours. So the integration object might simply be out of date. I might need to compile it, or I might need to flush the integration object cache and then flush the web service cache. So let's do that now. Example integration objects are provided in your download pack that are different from the ones in the original white paper CIF file that have come straight from my environment, so you know they work. So I'm going to go to the GetMetadata Response, and I'm going to flush the integration object cache, and then probably I'll have to flush the web service cache as well. And let's try one more time. That's very much what we're looking for. The metadata response is a list of tables which corresponds to your business components, or rather your integration components, and fields which correspond to your integration component fields. The supplied workflows are based on a integration object that has a primary business component of contact, so expect to see lots of fields like first name, last name, and so on. I'm going to save this and exit for now.